Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to All Metal Mode here on Spreaker.com. This is Dennis Wynn. I'm kind of hanging out for Mike Hare this evening, and I just want to welcome everybody here. We're going to have a really good series, I believe, coming up here in All Metal Mode. We're going to have Mr. Dorian Cook. You know, he's a great orator, and he's going to be filling us in on the real story behind William Quantrell and some lost treasures over the next three or four episodes. And before I pull Dorian in, just wanted to remind everybody that tonight's episode is going to be using some photographs, and those photographs are numbered. You can pick those up and get them to your computer through All Metal Mode Facebook. Or if you go to allmetalmode.com, finish your registration, and Mike is going to be monitoring that pretty tightly here in the next hour or so. And so if you'll go on and register, he'll get you pushed through right away. So it'd be good if you can grab the pictures right quick. That'll kind of help you understand along. This is going to be an interesting story, I suspect, over the next few weeks. I also want to tell you that obviously if you guys are looking for a great digging tool, be sure and look at predatortools.com or give Pam a call. Her phone number there at Predator Tools is 856-455-3790. And I'm going to tell you, from personal experience, I've used their tools a long time, and I really have a high level of confidence through every situation I've used them for. So, again, if you need a good digging tool, go to predatortools.com. Finally, before we get started, I just wanted to let y'all know that on Friday night, we're going to have All Metal Mode here, and Mike Hare is going to be having a discussion on air testing and test beds that are out there and how they're created and what useful purposes they might serve, and then the nail test board. He and I were discussing this before we started coming on, and he had some interesting outlook about it, and I think that it'd be well worth your time to listen to that too. So that being said, let me see if I can get Dorian. Dorian, are you there?
I am here.
All right.
I am champing at the bit.
Chomping at the bits. That's good.
Yes, sir.
I know what that is. When I was up there visiting you, that's what we did every day.
Yes, we did. Yes, we did. I'd like to give our listeners a little bit of backstory on you and I. Dennis and I go way back into the 70s. Dennis, correct me if I'm wrong. Did I take you on your first Civil War rally hunt?
Indeed, you did.
I thought I did, yes. Okay. So
I haven't been the same since either.
I don't know if you mean that in a positive or a negative way.
Exactly.
Exactly. Okay. Okay. I resemble that statement, right?
Absolutely. Okay. You created a monster.
Well, Dennis and I go way back, and I had the pleasure of hosting Dennis as a guest here at our little Appalachian Mountain Hideaway. And it was Dennis's first time up in this part of the country. And we had 4 days, and boy, we planned great things, and we got thoroughly rained out and flooded out for 4 days. The only time it didn't rain when I was going to the airport to get him, and when I was taking him back. So we had 4 days to look each other in the eyeball and tell our stories and everything. And little did we know that we were actually practicing, I think, to take over the controls here on this cybernetic airplane and see if we could fly it to a destination. So, Dennis, it's a pleasure to have you as a co-host tonight.
Well, thank you, brother. I appreciate it, and I will not even tell them, one, how you tried to kill me with that branch that was so big you whacked me with, and then, of course, I won't talk about the Sasquatch y'all terrified me with either. But anyway, let's take off. What'd you call this, a cybernetic airplane? Good Lord. That's kind of like Jefferson Starship or something. I don't know, man.
Well, Dennis, just think of those those little moments of drama as a rite of passage, and you know, and maybe that'll comfort you emotionally there.
There you go. The student sits at the feet of the master. So let's roll, well, brother.
I'm not the master when it comes to the technical control. Dennis is really good at that, and he was the only one we knew of that could take Mike's responsibilities on in that regard at short notice. And we really appreciate Mike letting us have the opportunity to do this. You know, we're both old geezers, and we relate to each other real well. Oh, but I'm still young at heart.
There you go.
Well, Dennis, I'm actually going to put you on the spot tonight with the first thing to start off this new series. When did the Civil War start and where?
Oh, good Lord. Let's see. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay, that's my answer.
Okay, you were close.
Yeah, thank you. It's 1860.
1861, and at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, is the official beginning, and that's really not correct. The Civil War started in 1854. It lasted 11 years, not 4. And we're going to be talking about that. I'm going to prove that to everybody that's listening. And those extra 7 years created an awful lot of potential relic and treasure sites that there are no written records of, other than of things that are alluded to in one book that I'm going to be working heavily from tonight. For those of you who are interested in making history and finding some Quantrill guerrilla relic sites, you will get some leads that are absolutely second to none, and I'm sure a good percentage of these leads have never yet been found. So there will be also the potential for caches, many caches, when you understand the Quantrill guerrillas and what exactly they did, which has never been elaborated properly in history. Well, Dennis, I'll try to get you involved as much as we can here. And in the week that comes, I'll give you some homework that you can read up on, and then we can have probably more interaction on part 2. So, but we will try to get you in there as much as possible.
Works for me, brother.
I appreciate you handling the technical details, because that allows me to concentrate on what I do a lot better than technical stuff, which is tell stories. So anyway, I'm going to be working heavily from a book. If you'll look at photo 1, if you're following along on the photos, the actual, whoops, I hit the wrong program. Hang on.
Hey, Dorian, while you have this little pause here, just for anybody that just joined us, you can get these photos right quick. You can go to All Metal Mode on Facebook and get it there, or you can finish your registration or register there on allmetalmode.com, and Mike is monitoring that this evening, and he said he'd push you on through real quick. So we've had a couple of folks that have joined us in addition, so there you go. All right, Dorian.
Okay. I'm going to be drawing heavily from a book. The title is A True Story of Charles W. Quantrell, Trell, and His Guerrilla Band by J.P. Birch. Now, this book, I first saw it in the 1970s. Charles Garrett had a copy that he let me borrow, and I photocopied the whole book because I could not find one at the time. Now it has been reprinted, and it is available. You can find it online. And I forgot to check the price on it, so I don't know what the new copies are. But you might want to pick
$55 for y'all.
Are they? Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. There should be some cheaper than that. It's not a big book, but boy, is it packed with information that there's no other source as good as this one. Because even though the author's name is John P. Birch, the story belongs to Harrison Trow, Captain Harrison Trow. Captain Harrison Trow rode with Quantrill for all 4 years of the war. He saw the good, the bad, the ugly. He had intimate conversations with Quantrill about his early life, and probably was one of the men that knew Quantrill better than anybody. He was a very, very intelligent man, and you will see that when I read you quotes from his book. His vocabulary exceeds ours. It really does. His education was very impressive for that period of history. And Harrison Trow was also a member of the KGC, of the Knights of the Golden Circle. He got very high up in the organization as the years went by, and all of that's pretty secret stuff. He served right after the war, and I forget his first name, Governor Crittenden. Governor Crittenden was the governor of Missouri after the war, and he was actually on the 12-member inner circle, which would relate to what we would call today board of directors. He was one of the top 12 in the entire Golden Circle organization, and here he was a governor of an entire state right after the Civil War. Boy, would the feds have gone ape over that if they'd known. Anyway, his number one assistant was none other than Harrison Trow. So Harrison Trow, look, you can see pictures number 3, and then number 4 is one of my favorite pictures. It's Harrison Trow and Kentucky Frank James standing side by side, and Harrison's tipping his hat. Looks very dignified in that photo. Very sharp man, very, very capable of expressing himself. And so basically what Birch did was simply write down what Harrison told him. And so we're as close as we can get to having a conversation about the Quantrill guerrillas and William Clark Quantrill himself. Now, he wrote this book about a man he calls Charles W. Quantrell. And there was a reason why he used an alias, because William Clark Quantrill did not die, as history proclaims he did, in the barn lot of a Kentucky doctor's farm near the end of the war. He did survive that. He would have died in that lot, but he was rescued by Jesse and Frank James, pulled out of a fight they couldn't win against a heavy unit of cavalry. And that will come into the story towards the end. I don't want to go too far down that road. But anyway, he would come to be the actual head, Dennis, of the KGC. William Clark Quantrill was so intelligent, so brilliant, such a gifted strategist, and so quick, at thinking and getting out of bad situations, seeing instantly what to do. He had so much experience at it, as we will see as we go on. He was a remarkable individual, and he wasn't just a man who decided to be a Confederate guerrilla, and start raiding and killing soldiers and people and stuff. That is the way that the victors, the Yankees portray him. But we're going to get a look at the real William Quantrill and see what he did and see what made him a guerrilla. We're going to cover that here tonight, and I think you're going to be fascinated. Now, we're going to be laying some foundation, some backstory, and in episode 2, we'll start getting into some really heavy leads on Quantrill relic and battle sites that you might want to follow up on. So, you can take notes, or, of course, this will be recorded and you can go back and play it over again. But anyway, we're going to go ahead and get started here. And we're going to start, actually, going to go...
Hey, Dorian?
Yes.
While we have this pause, you keep on for a minute. Just everybody, just right quick, Dorian was talking earlier about that book, the actual book itself. And if you guys go to books.google.com and search for this book, you can actually download the book in PDF form. And I think that at least that way you've got the full information that is enclosed within this book itself without having to buy it necessarily. So that might be a good source for y'all.
Thanks, Dennis. Now they don't need to listen to the podcast.
Oh, no, they need to listen to you because you have more than in this book.
I do.
Go ahead.
I do. I have a second source in Jesse Lee James III, who was able to help me verify, fill in details and things. I do have information that's not in the book, and I will include it.
Go ahead.
I will include it where it belongs in the story.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be part of the most interesting thing that you're going to be able to share in this series is that tying this book and Quantrill into other aspects that will have interest to those of us that do like to pursue caches and things of that nature. So I know the book is one part of the story, brother, but I know just from talking with you a little bit about this, there's more to come.
You know, Dennis, we had a lot of fans of the Jesse James series, and we're really going to get into Jesse James, early life here. How he became a Quantrill guerrilla and what he did. You're going to hear some amazing stories about Jesse James in battle that was not in the Jesse James series. So for all of you Jesse James fans out there, I think we're going to kill two birds with one stone. Not only I think give you a new respect for William Clark Quantrill, but I think you're going to really be amazed when you find out the details of Jesse's years of fighting in the Civil War. Okay, so the reason why that we've got Charles W. Quantrill was because he had never been pardoned and he'd never surrendered. He was supposed to be dead, and if it ever came out that he wasn't dead, the federal government would probably leave no stone unturned trying to capture him and execute him. So this is why he wrote under a similar but false name, because that way he could call this book a fiction book, and the government could not come back on Tro anyway, or on anybody in the books, you see. He does use a lot of real names of the guerrillas and people that were involved in the book, but in this case, the name of William Clark Quantrill was left out deliberately to protect him. Now, Birch complained that it took him 20 years to get Tro to sit down and write this story, or give him the story. And there was a reason for that. Tro was waiting for some of the older people who had never surrendered and whom the federal government secretly wanted to capture and execute. He was waiting for them to get thoroughly ensconced in their new identities to where that they were under no threat anymore, or to die off, which of course they would be under no threat. So he put this guy off for 20 years deliberately. Now, he was almost 80 when he, as it were, dictated this book to the author that wrote, the ghostwriter here, we might call him. And you'd say, wow, man, he's 80 years old. He's probably forgotten most of this stuff, and he's got all the facts confused, and this isn't going to work. He's just going to be telling old man tales. Folks, let me tell you something about old men, because I am one. An amazing thing happens to you, and I have seen this in others, and I'd heard about it for years, and now I'm experiencing it, that as you get up into your 70s, your long-term memory, the ones that you have that go back to your childhood, they come back with remarkable clarity. And you can recall details, and it's almost like it just happened yesterday. What you have problems with is your short-term memory. I might be able. I can tell you every detail of the first rally hunt that Dennis and I had at Mansfield, Louisiana, but I might not be able to remember what I had for breakfast 3 days ago. You see. Well, it's the same with Tro. as he got into this and began to recall all of these details, all of these came back. So his age was actually a benefit in making this record, the only record we have that really gives us inside information on what happened with Quantrill and his guerrillas. So that being said, Birch mentions on the introduction page there, this narrative was written just as he told it to me, giving accounts of fights that he participated in, narrow escapes experienced, dilemmas that seemed impossible, almost impossible to get out of, and also other battles. The life of the James boys and the Youngers as they were with Quantrill during the war and after the war, when they became outlaws by publicity of the daily newspapers, being accused of things which they never did and which were laid at their feet. Of course, it says Captain Trow identified Jesse James when the latter was killed in St. Joseph. We know that Captain Trow did not. We know that Jesse James posed as Harrison Trow and identified the body of Charlie Bigelow as Jesse James. Trow made himself scarce until Jesse was done with that little charade. Because, of course, as a fellow Knights of the Golden Circle member, he was going to assist and help Jesse any way he could. But anyway, it's interesting because Trow was the last Confederate to surrender in the state of Missouri at the end of the war. Now, I want to talk about the early life of Quantrill. There are some people on the net that say, oh, he's from Dover Canal, Ohio. Well, no, he's not. He's from near Hagerstown, Maryland, and he was born on July the 20th, 1836, and apparently out in the country, in a country setting, not in Hagerstown, but near Hagerstown. It would have been the closest town. And he lived there until he was 16 years of age. We don't have, at this point, much information on his mother and father, but we do know that he got a really good education during that time, as far as, compared to the educations of the day. And you can see pictures of Hagerstown and the surrounding area in pictures numbers 8 through 11. Numbers 8 through 11. Of course, we only have Trow's account here, but Quantrill told him that he basically was an obedient and affectionate son. And maybe he was. That one, we're not going to be able to verify. But he was living, his mother had been left a widow when he was only a few years old, and we don't know how his father died. So probably he did have a sense of needing to help and encourage his mother, considering her loss. Now, he had a brother that actually, prior to 1860, actually prior to 1857, we're not sure how long, a few years at least, Quantrill's brother lived in Kansas. And my research indicates that the most probable area was Emporia, Kansas, which is west of Kansas City and slightly south. Well, apparently, young Charles got a letter. Let's see. He was about 21 years of age, and he got a letter from his brother, whose first name was not given, to come to him there in Kansas. And Charles did. He made the trip to Kansas. I say Charles because he calls him Charles. Quantrill made the trip to Kansas, and after he hooked up with his brother, they decided to go to California to the gold fields and hunt gold. So you can see at this point, this is 1857, 3 years or 4 years before the start of the war, officially. You can see that they're not interested in being involved in the war or in the struggles of slavers versus, abolitionists. They're just wanting to get out of the area. And there was a reason why, because there was a lot of trouble had started to build up in Missouri and Kansas, especially along the border, and say 100 miles into both states either way, west or east. And I think that they were trying to escape. They saw bad things coming and thought that California goldfields would be a much better place to be. So about the middle of the summer of 1857, they got started for California, and apparently they worked out some kind of a contract with a freight outfit to drive a wagon full of freight to pay their way out west. And they hadn't gone very far, about a day's travel, I think about 20 miles. And they got to a place where the road was very close to the Little Cottonwood River. It's near a little town today called, which wasn't there then, called Cottonwood Falls, Kansas. And they thought that would, be a good place to camp along the river. Now, if you'll take a look at pictures 12 through 14, you'll see the area that I'm talking about here. So, it looked like that their trip was off to a good start. But suddenly, they had a really big problem. It'd gotten dark. They'd finished supper. And out of the night suddenly appeared 21 what looked like Federal soldiers with red leather leggings from their boots to their knees. They were dressed in Federal uniforms with eagle buttons on them. And they were under the command of Colonel Jim Lane, who lived at Lawrence, Kansas. And they didn't waste any time. They rode right up and they shot Quantrill's brother dead. And they shot Quantrill and wounded him badly. And they took everything that they could find, money, anything of value. And they took the black man who was with them, was traveling with them to do their cooking. Quantrill remarked later that they thought more of the black man than they did all the rest of the loot. So once they had loaded up their plunder, they rode off into the night and left William Clark Quantrill there to die, and along with his brother to be eaten by the wolves or other wild animals, the buzzards and so on. Now these men looked like Federal soldiers. They were technically Federal soldiers, but the reality was they were of the worst kind of criminal element. We're going to be talking about them. They were called Jayhawkers, and I'll tell you why they were called Jayhawkers here shortly. Now, before I tell you what happened after they rode off, I want to talk to you a little bit about what was going on in the Kansas Territory at this time, so you'll understand with a bigger view of what was happening in this part of the country, because very few of you, if any, are really familiar with just what went on in this area of the country in those years, 1854 to 1861, before the war started, and continued all the way through the war. Because what we're going to see is they had in the Kansas Territory and the state of Missouri, with that border being the dividing line, they had 11 years of the most brutal warfare imaginable. 11 years. If you don't know about these first 7 years and you went and studied the Civil War battles in Missouri and Kansas, you would only have a small fraction of the total battles and fights and skirmishes that took place. Only a small fraction. Because very few of these, except a few of the bigger ones, got any publicity or even recorded during those 7 years before the Civil War officially started. What do you think, Dennis, about that idea of the war starting in 1854? You think that's possible?
You know, the amazing part of that, Dorian, is that runs so contrary to everything that we've been taught and everything I've ever heard about it up until our conversation tonight. Honestly, I was not aware of that, but that's something just, it's really of interest to me because that really opens up the possibility for a lot of information that's gained out there. Just, you bet.
Well,
I'm surprised, like probably everybody here.
Fasten your seatbelt because I got some more incredible things to come.
All right.
All right. So we have a starting date for these that brought these criminals in uniform into being, and they began to terrorize both Kansas and Missouri. They made raids into Missouri. They made raids across the Kansas territory. It got so bad so quick that the Kansas territory was not yet a state. It wouldn't become a state until January, I forget the day, January of 61. It was just as the Civil War was about to start, it became a state. But right now it's a territory, and it became to be called Bleeding Kansas because of the violence that began to fill the area on both sides of the border. And this was one area of the country, the only area of the country where slavery, anti-slavery, or pro-slavery was clearly the dividing line between the people in both states. You don't see in states even like Tennessee, South Carolina, North Carolina, you don't see this kind of clearly defined knocking of heads, so to speak, over slavery versus no slavery. Kansas, the abolitionists, those who were against slavery, did not want slavery to be allowed in Kansas, and they were called free staters. Free staters. The Missourians, basically, there was a lot of slavery in Missouri, and there was an element of rougher men. They were called border ruffians, and they resisted the free staters, and the resistance began to escalate. But as near as I can find out, these men in federal uniforms wearing these red leggings were called red legs and jayhawkers. And the ones that attacked the Quantrill brothers camp were under the command of Colonel Jim Lane of Lawrence, Kansas. Jim Lane would be promoted to general in the Federal Army, and he would become a senator from Kansas for all 4 years of the Civil War. And he would continue being the leader of these jayhawkers because what they had done to Quantrill and his brother was routine for them. They were doing it all over the area, and they were supposed to be targeting pro-slavery people, Southerners, what we call Southerners. But they didn't make too much difference. Instead of setting that black cook free, saying, we've rescued you, congratulations, now you can. Of course, we don't know that he was a slave. He could have been a free man. But if he was a slave, instead of rescuing him, I'll guarantee you they took him and sold him back to some slaver in Missouri, because they were all about profit and money, and the enjoyment of brutal murder. They enjoyed it, and they carried it out with abandon. Now, Bleeding Kansas, according to the Historical Society of Kansas, was as much about terror, that is, the threat of death, as it was about spilled blood. Now, they say much of the violence was exaggerated by the press, with both Southern and Northern newspapers playing up acts of aggression. And they claimed that most of the events referred to as battles were little more than skirmishes, and the forts nothing more than reinforced log cabins. But anyway, in spite of that, the nation believed all of Kansas to be a bloody battleground. And the funny thing is, they were right. In truth, it actually was. Many atrocities, and I'm talking atrocities in the hundreds, were occurring at remote farms and homes where all the evidence of the crimes against these poor farmers, and these were not just farmers who had pro-Southern leanings or had slaves, because the Redlegs discovered it was much more profitable not to make too much of a difference between pro-slavers and anti-slavers. And so they did this to both. They learned to go, they evolved quickly from terrorizing, giving beatings, and just stealing from the people to totally looting everything of value they had, torturing the family to death, raping the women, killing the children, stringing the father up, pulling him off the ground slowly so he had to struggle to die with a noose around his neck, and pouring coal oil on him and setting him on fire while he was strangling to death. This is how horrible, terrible the warfare was. And this was happening as early as 1854, and each year that passed, it got worse and worse. You know, once they would kill everybody, they'd throw them in the house after they'd gotten everything out, set the house on fire, and the evidence burn up. And because they might be out in a remote area without much contact with others, except maybe once a month going into town to buy supplies or something, by the time anybody knew that these people were not there anymore, and nobody knew if they had died or if they had just, as refugees, had fled the area. So it'll never be known how many people were killed and how many just fled the Kansas-Missouri area. But once they would kill, they would load the plunder up into farmers' wagons, and then one of the Redlegs would drive the wagon to town or to wherever they stored their plunder till they could dispose of it, and then they would sell the wagons. So this is what was going on. And, even if you were fortunate enough not to be one of those who experienced this kind of violence, you had to live with the fear of it, because whether you were pro-slavery or against slavery, either position could bring bad men to your door. Many people slept with their guns by their bedsides, determined to sell their lives dearly, if necessary, and others just sent their families away, and citizens formed militias and built defenses in their towns. They did. There were whole little towns in Missouri that built stockade like Fort Apache all the way around the town. And not too much of that is known. So people were really, it would seem, into this thing. But very quickly, with all of the atrocities, here's some sons came back to find their homes burned and their family slain. What do you think it did to that grown son? It filled him with a white-hot rage for revenge. The outrage of what had been done to his family. And that was repeated over and over and over and over. And it worked to create a type of soldier such as the world, at that time had never seen before. And I'll be explaining you all about that as we go along. Now, let's talk about the Jayhawkers and the Border Ruffians. We're going to get back to Quantrill laying there all wounded and everything. Just bear with me. I mentioned that these Jayhawkers, these 21 men that attacked and killed the older brother and badly wounded Quantrill, were under the command of Colonel James Lane at the time. Now, Lane had moved to Lawrence, Kansas in 1855. And even though he was a Democrat, he became affiliated with the Free Staters, and he soon became a leader of the Jayhawkers. So later they made him a general, and then, of course, a U.S. senator. He was both a general and a U.S. senator at the same time. He organized and led the 3rd and 4th Kansas Volunteer Infantry and the 5th Kansas Cavalry, and he led them on raids into Missouri a lot of times. And, we hear a lot about Lawrence, Kansas. Quantrill massacred everybody in Lawrence, Kansas, and burned the town to the ground is what most people think happened. And there is a world of error in that perception. We'll be getting to Lawrence, but probably won't be until the next episode or the next part in the series. But the point is, you hear about Lawrence, right? Dennis, did you know that Lawrence got sacked not once but twice?
I did not.
Yeah, I'm going to be talking about the first sack of Lawrence here tonight. But the second one, which is the one Quantrill did, we'll get into as it falls into the series chronologically.
Dorian, somebody here, or Scotty here on the list, mentioned Josie Wells. I know we discussed that the other day.
Yeah.
Tell them about Josie Wells, what you told me. How accurate it was or was not.
The treatment of the surrendered guerrillas at the beginning was very true to life in the movie, and Clint Eastwood did a bang-up job of portraying, a guerrilla and the problems that they had after the war was over, the ones that survived. So it's interesting because, Josie Wells didn't trust the Yankees, and he survived. And that's the way Quantrill was, and that saved him many, many a time. But I don't want to get ahead of myself here.
Okay.
Okay, so what you never heard about, did you know that the Jayhawkers under Jim Lane, they burned most of the town of Osceola, Missouri, stole everything they could, and they freed the slaves in the town? You never heard about that, have you? See? Dennis, are we still hooked up?
We are. Keep going.
Okay.
I had it on mute for a minute. No, I never heard that.
Okay, yeah. I doubt if anybody else has either. Osceola, Missouri, so they raided the town. They burned the town, and it doesn't tell me how many people they killed there, but they would have killed a bunch. And what was lost? How many caches were lost when Osceola was burned? Of course, that's probably all been basically rebuilt by now on that land. But anyway, point is, it wasn't a one-way street. It wasn't just, Quantrill, just without provocation, attacked Lawrence, Kansas, and killed all the men, women, and children, and burned the town down. No, he didn't. It wasn't. But this did happen. They did burn most of the town of Osceola, and it was these men in federal uniforms with the red legs that did it.
Dorian, just as a quick aside, because
sure,
I just want to insert something, as you know, and I think Mike knows, but I want to share something with the audience right quick, because it's easy to think in terms of what these folks did, and specifically I'm referring to putting kerosene oil on them and burning them. And I want to tell just the audience here that I was actually burned when I was a young guy, and 6 years later I joined the fire service. But being burned, I spent 7 weeks in the hospital, had 8 subsequent surgeries, wore a neck brace for 3 years. But the pain, if you've ever burned your hand, you know how intense that is on a hot iron or hot grease or anything. If you could possibly extend that to your entire body, I was burned on the chest up, but the intensity of that pain is what I call an exquisite pain, and it truly goes beyond what you can conceive in just talking about it. And my point that I wanted to kind of just bring to the audience and to make an impact statement about is what they did to those people is about as horrific as it can get, and short of dismembering their body, there's just no pain that would compare with burning somebody up. And nowadays, you know, the psychological damage that would occur to someone seeing that kind of pain over time would be immense. And that basically, in my opinion, based on what I know of that experience and what training I've had, you know, it basically made in these in the folks a more of an animal type instinct for them, or they became more of an animal, because when you inflict kind of pain that does, it just, you can't walk away from that same person. And I hate to, you know, I apologize for getting off on that particular tangent, but I'm going to tell you something, just from my personal experience, and that is a 30-year career firefighter, and having seen people that have died and seen people dying from fire, that is a very significant and horrific way to go. And yet these folks out there back then, they were doing that to people. And that's a horrific death, I tell you. Anyway,
yes,
enough of my dialogue.
I'm not trying to be gruesome here for the sake of being gruesome.
Not at all. No.
I'm relating this because if you don't understand this, if you don't understand the total lack of mercy,
yes,
they couldn't just rob them, you know, and say, okay, you know, give us your valuables, and as long as you don't reach for your gun, you know, we'll spare your life. Yep. They took pleasure in this.
Exactly.
And the surviving relatives that found their loved ones like this, what was left of them, could see that no compassion or mercy had been shown at all. Now, you take those relatives and you make soldiers out of them.
Yep.
And please understand, for the people that were, you know, they'd grown up, they had slaves, they're maybe inherited, you know, from their grandfather or whatever. Or the point was, it was a way of life. I'm not justifying it, but I'm just saying that they couldn't understand. These boys were not hardened killers. They were people like us, you know, and they loved and they worked hard in the fields. You know, they were not lazy. Missouri doesn't have a whole lot of great soil, and if you're going to survive farming in Missouri, buddy, you worked for it. Believe me. I've hunted in Missouri, and I've never seen any good soil there. There may be some. You know, I haven't been hunted every corner of the state, but I've spent enough time there to know there's a lot of soil that's not that great.
See, I think that what occurred with those families that came back, I believe a lot of them, it gave a great resolve and an anger that carried through the rest of their life, probably.
Well, and yes, it did, Dennis, and that's going to factor, very, very important factor in understanding Quantrill and his men. If we're going to judge them based on what they did in the war, we have to understand where they were coming from and what turned them into what, by the time we're done, I think arguably you will see they were probably the world's greatest cavalry force to ever exist. And that will be brought out, and you know, I'll share the secrets with you about why they were the greatest cavalry force. And like I said, they're fascinating to me to this very day, and I think they will be to most of our listeners too. Okay, so the Civil War actually began in 1854, and it escalated every year. See, the problem is once robberies, just simple robberies, threats, and beatings gave way to tortures, murders, and burnings, and then they occurred on both sides of the border. Each side stereotyped the other, and revenge was used as the excuse to escalate. So each year, there were more and more violent acts, more and more people died, more and more terrible tortures were done, and that would go on in Missouri and Kansas all through the war until 1865. Can you imagine 11 long years of this? Think about that in our present society today. Think of when you go to sleep tonight, that you had to be in fear of criminals coming onto your place and doing the worst possible things to you and your family and stealing everything you have and burning you out. How would you like to go to sleep tonight with that fear? How about tomorrow night, the next night, next week, next month, and next year with no cessation, no ceasing of it? Every single night, you would have to live with this fear. You would have to keep your guns ready. You would have to try to rig up all kinds of security devices. But the truth is, you're one family and a force of 20 to 50 men ride right in, all armed to the teeth on you. How long can you hold them off? I had a man on Facebook the other day said, I've got a whatever. He has a M16 and 100,000 rounds of ammunition. Well, I'll guarantee you, he will not get off that 100,000 rounds of ammunition if he's forced to defend his house. He'll be doing good to get off 100 rounds of ammunition before he's killed. But anyway, this is what existed in this area at this time. Now, the Southern guys, they didn't wear uniforms. They just old farm clothes. The border ruffians, as the abolitionists called them, because the border ruffians were pro-slavery. Listen to this. This is an excerpt from a New York Tribune article in 1857. The border ruffians, you'll like this, Dennis. The border ruffians' chief occupation is loafing around whiskey shops and pilfering from free state men. They generally carry a large bowie knife and talk about their exploits in Kansas among the damned abolitionists. Printed in the newspaper. Now, the Kansans called them the Missourians border ruffians because this is according to the Missouri Historical Society, because they crossed the state line to vote illegally and steal property. The Missourians who crossed the border to cast fraudulent votes added greatly to the tensions between anti- and pro-slavery settlers, though most of them did not own slaves themselves. They viewed Kansas as an extension of the slave state and supported slavery in the new territory. And they mentioned a guy named George Clark was one prominent pro-slavery man who engaged in acts of violence along the border, and I have not looked him up yet. Here's an interesting quote from a settler who lived in Lecompton, Kansas, and he gave this quote to a newspaper reporter in 1856. Excuse me just a second. I need to get a drink of water here. And I'll read this to you. I never lie down without taking the precaution to fasten my door. I have my rifle, revolver, and old home stock pistol where I can lay my hand on them in an instant besides a hatchet and axe. I take this precaution to guard against the midnight attacks of the abolitionists, that is, the Jayhawkers. And this was a fellow named Axala Hoole, Hoole, from Lecompton, Kansas. Okay, so there were 3 acts of violence that were big enough to really attract the attention of the nation. And the first, Dennis, was the first sack of Lawrence, which happened in 1856. See, Lawrence was a well-known anti-slavery town, and its newspapers constantly criticized the pro-slavery territorial government. Getting some feedback there.
No, my phone went off. Sorry about that.
Okay, all right. As a result, a pro-slavery grand jury stated that the newspapers in the Free State Hotel were nuisance that could be removed. Shortly thereafter, a pro-slavery mob attacked Lawrence, looting homes and destroying businesses. The Free State Hotel was destroyed because it was the headquarters for the Free State leadership and a symbol of the anti-slavery cause. The newspaper Herald of Freedom was a major anti-slavery voice in Kansas. Its presses were destroyed and dumped in the Kansas River. So, there you go, Dennis. The first sack of Lawrence, 1856.
Wow. And what was dumped in the river?
The printing presses. Okay, now, the next one was called the Pottawatomie Massacre, and it occurred in 1856. And let's see. "11 Free State men." Oh, wait a minute. That's a different massacre. Okay. I've got my notes out of order here.
That too happens with age every once in a while.
Well, I've got a lot of complicated notes, and that's trying to keep. If I was just working out of the one book, it wouldn't be a problem. But I'm adding stuff in between, chapters and things to flesh out some of the information that Tro gives. Okay. I did not copy the details of the Pottawatomie. Oh, yeah, I know what it is. The Pottawatomie Massacre was by none other than the famous man John Brown. Now, John Brown got angry after Lawrence was sacked, and he thought he ought to strike terror in the hearts of the pro-slavery people. So Brown and a small group of men, including some of his sons, violently murdered 5 men living on Pottawatomie Creek. And this doesn't tell the whole story at all. They also killed their wives and children. Now, these pro-slavery men had not been involved in the sack of Lawrence. Well, guess what? You better believe they hadn't, because they weren't even pro-slavery men. They were not Southerners. They were anti-slavery men. And Brown didn't make a difference. He didn't bother to find out. He decided arbitrarily that they needed to die, and he killed them. And wait till you hear how he killed them. He didn't shoot them down. He hacked them to death with his sword. Once they had guns on them and they had them all disarmed, he hacked them to death one at a time with his sword. Now, I'm going to ruin a song for a whole bunch of you folks out there, a song you've known for a long time. Dennis, you're familiar with the Battle Hymn of the Republic.
Okay, yeah.
Written by Harriet Beecher Stowe.
Right. She
idolized John Brown. And there is a line in the song that says, "He has loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword." Do you remember that line?
I do. You're not going to do this, are you?
I'm sorry. She is praising John Brown for these murders with his sword. I haven't been able to sing that song since I learned that. It used to be one of my favorites. Boy. Wow. Yeah. So Brown, I mean, it was crazy, insane what he did to these families. There was 3 families, I think, living there together, just for supposedly to help them be more secure, but it didn't work. Then they had the Marais de, and I'm not good at pronouncing French. It's Cygnes, Marais de Cygnus. Okay, massacre in 1858. And you can go to picture number 22 if you want to see a drawing of it. 11 Free State men were taken from their homes in Lynn County, lined up in a ravine and shot. 5 died, 5 were wounded, and 1 escaped injury by pretending to be dead. The attack was led by Charles Hamilton, a pro-slavery man previously run out of Kansas by Free State raiders. And this is interesting. In 1859, John Brown sat at a friend's desk to write what became known as the Parallels. This letter, which published widely in newspapers, pointed out that white posses were being organized to find John Brown, or while posses were being organized to find John Brown, nothing was being done to prosecute Charles Hamilton. So Brown left Kansas shortly after he wrote the Parallels, and he spent 1859 raising funds and planning a slave insurrection that would begin at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia, with an attack on the federal arsenal, which he did attempt. He armed the rebelling slaves with pikes he had purchased from a Connecticut blacksmith. The attack failed, and Brown was hanged for treason in December 1859. Okay, so all this stuff is going on. Now you see what was going on around Quantrill and his brother. How sad, because just another day or two and they would have been beyond range of these bad guys. But that's fate. So meanwhile, let's go back to the Cottonwood River camp. Badly wounded William Quantrill would end up laying there for 3 days next to his brother's body, feebly keeping the buzzards and the wolves off of it, while he was getting weaker and weaker from blood loss. And he was nearly dead at the end of 3 days when an old Shawnee Indian named Spy Buck, S-P-Y-E is how it's spelled, Spy Buck, happened to come along, buried his brother, and took William to his home, and he nursed him back to life and strength. Now, William Quantrill had been wounded so bad that it took him between 6 months and a year to recover before he was able to get back to, what approached normal movement and energy and everything. So, of course, he's, everything he had was stolen. He doesn't have anything. It was stolen by the Redlegs. So he got a school teacher's job thanks to his good education. And he taught till he'd earned enough money to pay the old Indian for keeping him while he was sick and to get him to Lawrence. Now, I want to really emphasize, here we have a young man, 21, excited about going to California and just working in the gold fields and maybe, making their fortune. It's American dream. And suddenly, although he's done nothing to deserve it, he is not involved in the slavery issue. He just got to Kansas from Maryland. And he's the victim of terrible atrocities, both in the loss of his brother, the loss of everything they owned, and his almost death. What do you think that did to Quantrill's mind and his thinking? Put yourself in his position.
Obviously, it's just like that same thing I said with somebody being burned. That instilled in him an anger, I'm sure. and a sense of desire for revenge, which I think plays on out through this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When he got to Lawrence, now this shows you his intelligence. He went to where Jim Lane was stationed with his company. He had already worked out a plan to get into the company that murdered his brother and wounded himself. So, after a few days, he got his wish, and they inducted him into the Jayhawker units, the Red Legs. And as far as anybody could tell from the outside, he was a full-fledged Red Leg. But in his heart, he was only doing it to seek revenge on those who killed his brother. Now, he'd taken the alias of Charles Hart, H-A-R-T, and he worked himself into a friendship with Jim Lane. And he pretended to attach himself to the fortunes of the anti-slavery party. And he did this to get him a step nearer his goal. I'm sorry. In order to obtain his object and get a step nearer his goal, it became necessary for him to speak of John Brown. He always spoke of him to General Lane, who was at that time Colonel Lane. And this is where it really starts to get interesting. In command of a regiment at Lawrence, I'm reading this wrong here. Sorry. Change pages. Okay. Who was at that time Colonel Lane in command of a regiment at Lawrence? A regiment, 1,000 men. And he convinced Lane that he had great admiration for John Brown. So Quantrill got enrolled in a company in the regiment. You'll like this, Dennis. Held all but 2 of the men who had done the deadly work at Cottonwood, Kansas.
Mm.
First, as a private, he advanced to become an orderly and then a sergeant. Quantrill soon gained the esteem of his officers and the confidence of his men. One day, Quantrill and 3 men were sent down in the neighborhood of Wyandotte to meet a wagon load of black slaves coming up to Missouri under the pilotage of Jack Wynn. This is not Y-N-N-E, this is W-I-N-N. A somewhat noted horse thief and abolitionist, I'll get it right. One of the 3 men failed to return with Quantrill, nor could any account be given of his absence until his body was found near a creek several days afterwards. In the center of his forehead was the round, smooth hole of a Navy revolver bullet. Those who looked for Jack Wynn's safe arrival were also disappointed. People traveling the road passed the corpse almost daily, and the buzzards found it first, and afterwards the curious. There was the same round hole in the forehead and the same sure mark of the Navy revolver bullet. This thing went on for several months, scarcely a week passing, but that some sentinel was found dead at his post, some advanced pickets surprised and shot at his outpost watch station. Obviously, young Quantrill wasn't short on bravery. But remember, he had the motivation of revenge. And what the motivation of revenge does to men, it takes away their normal fear of injury to themselves. So anyway, the men in the company began to whisper one to another and to cast about, for what they called the cavalry Jonah, that is, who was the guy in the middle, or who was the guy in their midst that was killing them. Now, one company alone, that of Captain Pickens, the company to which Quantrill belonged, had lost 13 men between October 1859 and 1860. Other companies had lost 2 or 3 each. A railroad conductor named Rogers had been shot through the forehead. Quantrill and Pickens became intimate as a captain and lieutenant of the same company should, and confided many things to each other. One night, the story of the Cottonwood River was told by Pickens, and he dwelt with more than just a little relish upon it, not realizing he was talking to the very man that he might have been the one who shot. 3 days later, Pickens and two of his most reliable men were found dead on Bull Creek, shot like the balance in the middle of the forehead. That was to become Quantrill's trademark. But look at all this experience he's getting in military structure, in command. You see how he's transforming from a young 21-year-old boy headed for the goldfields to an officer that has a flair for black operations. In other words, stuff like the Navy SEALs would do. I mean, he's behaving like special forces here. He has set a goal, he worked out a plan, and he's carrying it out successfully right in the midst of his enemies.
Something else right quick that really stands out to me is that he faced them head on from the sounds of it.
Yep.
And with a Colt 32 or Colt Navy 32 caliber, right? So
44.
Okay. All right. Well, he faced them head on. That speaks volumes about what he was willing to endure. It also says how confident he was and able to carry that out, especially against more than one adversary.
Yeah, and if you notice, there wasn't any of that, any torture, any rage to make them suffer. It was simply, there was a pragmatic, you wounded me, you killed my brother, you have to pay for it, you're dead. You see? This shows you how he thought. So anyway, it says for a time Pickens' death there was a law. For a time after Pickens' death there was a law in the killings. And the new lieutenant bought himself a splendid uniform, owned the best horse in the territory, and instead of one Navy revolver now had two. And about this time, there was all kinds of organizations springing up, one was called the Free Soil Club, Men of Equal Rights, Sons of Liberty. Now, Sons of Liberty was one of the 5 secret Confederate organizations, and they were under the authority of the Knights of the Golden Circle. And here's one I'm not familiar with, Destroying Angels. And then there's Lane's Loyal Leaguers. And everyone was making haste to get his name signed to both the Constitution and bylaws. So Lawrence, Kansas, especially created and supported the Liberator Club, whose undivided mission was to found freedom for all the slaves now in Missouri. Quantrill persevered in his efforts to kill all the men who'd had a hand in injuring him and killing his brother. And with this purpose in mind, he talked 7 of the liberators into cooperating with him in an attack on a man named Morgan Walker. Now, these 7 men that Quantrill picked were the last except 2 of the men he had sworn vengeance upon when left to die at Cottonwood River. He told them that Morgan Walker had a lot of slaves, horses, and cattle, and money, and that the sole purpose was to rob and kill him. Quantrill's only aim was to get these 7 men. Morgan Walker was an old citizen of Jackson County, a venerable pioneer who had settled there when buffalo grazed on the prairie beyond Westport, and where in the soft sands beyond the inland streams there were wolf and Indian moccasin tracks. This man, Morgan Walker, was the man Quantrill had proposed to rob. He lived some 5 or 6 miles from Independence, and he owned about 20 blacks of various ages and sizes. The probabilities were that a skillfully conducted raid might leave him without any slaves. So well mounted and armed, the little detachment left Lawrence quietly, rode 2 by 2 far apart until the first rendezvous was reached, a clump of timber at a ford on Indian Creek. It was the evening of the second day, and they tarried long enough to rest their horses and eat a hearty supper. And before daylight the next morning, the entire party was hidden in some heavy timber about 2 miles west of Walker's house. There these 7 men stayed, none of them stirring except Quantrill. Several times during the day, however, he went backwards and forwards, apparently to the fields where the slaves were at work, and whenever he returned, he brought something either for the horses or the men to eat. Now, old man Walker had 2 sons, and before it was light, these boys and their father were seen putting into excellent order their double-barrel shotguns, and a little later, 3 neighbors who likewise carried double-barrel shotguns rode up to the house. Quantrill, who brought news of many other things to his comrades, brought no note of this. If he saw it, he made no sign. Now, when Quantrill arranged his men for the dangerous venture, they were to proceed first to the house, gain access to it, capture all the male members of the family, and put them under guard. Assemble all the Negroes and make them hitch up the horses to the wagons and then gallop them for Kansas. Now, 50 yards from the gate, the 8 men dismounted and fastened their horses, and the march to the house began. Quantrill led. He was very calm, and he seemed to see everything. The balance of his men had their revolvers in their hands, while he had his in his belt. So Quantrill knocked loudly at the oaken panel of the door. No answer. Knocked again, and stood perceptibly at one side. Suddenly the door flared open, and Quantrill leaped into the hall with a bound like a red deer. A livid sheet of flame burst through the darkness, where he had disappeared, followed by another as the second barrels of the guns were discharged, and the tragedy was over. 6 fell where they stood, riddled with buckshot. 1 staggered to the garden and died. The 7th, hard hit and unable to mount his horse, dragged himself to a patch of timber and waited for the dawn. They tracked him by the blood upon the leaves and found him early in the morning. Another volley, and the last liberator was liberated. Walker and his 2 sons, assisted by 3 of the stalwart and obliging neighbors, had done a clean night's work and a righteous one. This being the last of the Red Legs except 2 who murdered Quantrill's brother and wounded him in Cottonwood, Kansas in 1857, he closed his eyes and ears from ever being a scout for old Jim Lane anymore. The other 2 men, I might add, the missing 2 men were no longer connected to the Red Legs. He would catch up with them later, and he would also kill them. He eventually killed all 21 of the men that attacked him in the camp. That's a pretty impressive operation, wouldn't you say, Dennis?
Indeed. Okay. Absolutely. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
I was responding online and kept putting auto whatever, pop-up windows. Anyway, we're good. Yes, yeah, okay. It was impressive.
Okay, so a few days after the ambuscade at Walker's, Charles Quantrill, W. Quantrill, instead of Charles Hart as he was known, then was not afraid to tell his name on Missouri soil. He wrote to Jim Lane, telling him what had happened to the scouts sent out by him. And as the war was on then, Quantrill told Lane in his letter that he was going to Richmond, Virginia to get a commission from under Jeff Davis' own hand, which he did, as will come out farther on in our narrative, to operate on the border at will. There are people saying, well, Quantrill was never a commissioned officer, and yes, he was. He was commissioned a colonel. So, being equipped with all credentials, he notified Jim Lane of Missouri, telling him he would treat him with the same or better courtesy than Lane had treated him and his brother at Cottonwood River, Kansas in 1857. Well, Lane got mad about this, and he began to send his roving, robbing, and thieving bands into Missouri, and Charles Quantrill, having a band of well-organized guerrillas of about 50 men, was often there to see that there would be plenty of empty saddles to go back to Kansas. Every time they came in sight, Dennis, which was almost every day, they would have a fight to the finish, and it was Quantrill and company that finished it.
Wow.
None of these are recorded. See, all this skirmishing? This is an area so full of unrecorded sites, it would probably be one of the absolute best areas in the entire eastern half of the country to hunt Civil War relics cold turkey without, having researched a particular camp or a particular battle. Just hunting likely spots. There was so much of this because they fought all the time. It was like going to work every day. Honey, I'm leaving now. I'm going to work. I'll be back after I get my quota of 30 dead Yankees today. So anyway, I really have got to read to you in Harrison Tro's own words because I'm just so impressed with his ability to express himself. We're going to see some big words. The man was educated. Wow. But we want to get into why the Quantrill guerrillas were organized. There's some things that went on before he got to have 50 men, and we want to talk about that because there's things that happened in between there. Tro got ahead of himself a little bit there. So the Redlegs were basically the reason why the Quantrill guerrillas came to be. So for 2 years, Kansas hated Missouri, and at all times during those 2 years, there were Redlegs from old Jim Lane's army crossing the Missouri, stealing everything they could get their hands on, driving stock, insulting innocent women, that means raping them, and even children, and hanging and killing old men. So it's the province of history to deal with results, not to condemn the phenomena which produced them. Nor has it the right to decry the instruments, and we might say people. Providence always raises up in the midst of great catastrophes to restore the equilibrium of eternal justice. This guy was waxing eloquent here. So I hope you all will bear with me and just listen to a little bit of this here. Civil War might well have made the guerrilla, because he's going to tell you more about the guerrilla mindset, the guerrilla fighter, than you ever knew before. Now listen to this. Civil War might well have made the guerrilla, but only the excesses of Civil War could have made him the untamable and unmerciful creature that history finds him. When he first went to the war, he was somewhat imbued with the old-fashioned belief that soldiering meant fighting and that fighting meant killing. He had his own ideas of soldiering, however, and he desired nothing so much as to remain at home and meet its despoilers upon his own premises. Not naturally cruel and averse to invading the territory of any other people, he could not understand the patriotism of those who invaded his own territory. Pardon me, grab a drink of water here. This is really getting into the mindset of Quantrill and his men, and it's important to understand that, because in understanding the mindset, you'll understand how they accomplished the incredible deeds that I'm going to be relating to you later on. Here we go. Tro continues, patriotism, such as he was required to profess, could not spring up in the marketplace at the bidding of Redleg or Jayhawker. He believed indeed that the patriotism of Jim Lane and Jennison was another famous leader of Jayhawkers. His unit was the 7th Kansas Cavalry, and they called them Jennison's Jayhawkers. Anyway, the patriotism of Jim Lane and Jennison was merely a highway robbery transferred from the darkness to the dawn. In other words, they were doing it, quote unquote, legally under the guise of being federal soldiers. And he believed the truth. Neither did the guerrilla become merciless all of a sudden. Pastoral in many cases by profession. In other words, like a shepherd, gentle, in many cases by profession, and reared among the bashful and timid surroundings of agricultural life. He knew nothing of the tiger that was in him until death had been dashed against his eyes in numberless and brutal ways until the blood of his own kith and kin had been sprinkled plentifully upon things that his hands touched and things that entered into his daily existence. And that fury of ideas also came to him slowly, which is more implacable than the fury of men, for men have heart, and opinion has none. It took him likewise some time to learn that the Jayhawker's system of saving the Union was a system of brutal force which bewailed not even that which it crushed. In other words, that's a fancy way of saying showed no mercy to even to those that had surrendered, and belied its doctrine by its tyranny, stained its it should have been abrogated right by its violence, and dishonored its vaunted struggles by its executions. But blood is as contagious as air. The fever of civil war has its delirium. When the guerrilla awoke, he was a giant. He took in, as it were, and at a single glance, all the immensity of the struggle. He saw that he was hunted and proscribed. Proscribed means you're not allowed to use your own name. And that he had neither a flag nor a government, that the rights and amenities of civilized warfare were not to be his, that a dog's death was certain to be his if he surrendered, even in the extremest agony of battle, that the house which sheltered him had to be burned, the father who succored him had to be butchered, the mother who prayed for him had to be insulted, that means raped, the sister who carried him food had to be imprisoned, the neighborhood which witnessed his combats had to be laid waste, and the comrade shot down by his side had to be put to death as a wild beast. And so he lifted up the black flag, which means no quarter given, no mercy shown. He lifted up the black flag in self-defense and fought as became a free man and a hero. Okay, here's a 50-cent word. Much obloquy, I'm not even sure what that means, has been cast upon the guerrilla organization. I guess it's a negative, because in its name, bad men plundered the helpless, pillaged the friend and foe alike, assaulted non-combatants, and murdered the unresisting and the innocent. Such devil's work was not guerrilla work. It fitted all too well the hands of those cowards crouching in the rear of either army and courageous only where women defended what remained to themselves and their children. Desperate and remorseless as he undoubtedly was, the guerrilla saw shining upon his pathway a luminous patriotism, and he followed it eagerly that he might kill in the name of God and his country. The nature of his warfare made him responsible, of course, for many monstrous things he had no personal share in bringing about. Denied a hearing at the bar of public opinion of all the loyal journalists, and painted blacker than 10 devils, and given accountants that was made to retain some shadow of all the death agonies he had seen, is it strange in the least that his fiendishness became omnipresent as well as omnipotent? To justify one crime on the part of a federal soldier, 5 crimes more cruel were laid at the door of the guerrilla. His long gallop not only tired but infuriated his hunters. The savage standing at bay and dying always as a wolf dies when barked at by hounds and dudgeoned by countrymen made his enemies fear and hate him. Hence from all their bomb-proofs, his slanderers fired silly lies at long range and put afloat unnatural stories that hurt him only as it deepened the savage intensity of an already savage strife. I want to stop right there a minute. Are we getting the idea that he could not be treated as a regular soldier? Once he'd been branded as a guerrilla, the only solution that the federal side saw was to kill him, shoot him down, execute him, whatever it takes. So when he saw that he could not, we talk about our soldiers, the first thing they do if they get captured is they want to be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Well, these guys weren't going to get any kind of treatment of mercy, you see. They literally might as well fight to the death, because death was all that awaited them if they were captured. So that made them crazy brave too. They had nothing to lose. But you see the factors that came together, how they created these men, that they'd seen so much blood, and much of it shed by their own families. They could not be normal soldiers. There's no way. You see what I'm getting at, Dennis?
Yeah, absolutely. They were living outside the normal parameters of war as it was known up to them, up to that time.
Right. So that is the underlying factors that are going to create a guerrilla force, a cavalry force, if you please, such as the world has never seen. And under the brilliant leadership of William Clark Quantrill, they are going to accomplish things which, good grief, 10 regiments of Confederate soldiers couldn't do.
That's pretty amazing. Absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to read on. Except in rare and memorable instances, the guerrilla murdered only when fortune in open and honorable battle gave into his hands some victims who were denied that death in combat, which they afterward found by ditch or lonesome roadside. Man for man, he put his life fairly on the cast of the war dice, and died when the need came, as the Red Indian dies, stoical and grim as a stone. Strange as it may seem, the perilous fascination of fighting under a black flag, where the wounded could have neither surgeon nor hospital, and where all that remained to the prisoners was the absolute certainty of speedy death, attracted a number of young men to the various guerrilla bands, gently nurtured, born to higher destinies, capable of sustaining exertion in any scheme or enterprise. That is, they were capable of holding down really important jobs, and fit for callings high up in the scale of science or philosophy. Others came who had deadly wrongs to avenge, and these gave to all their combats that sanguinary hue which still remains a part of the guerrilla's legacy. Now remember, this is a guerrilla writing this. This is a captain, a leader of guerrillas, who fought like this for 4 full years. He's a man who is expert in his field and knows whereof he speaks. Almost from the first, a large majority of Quantrill's original command had over them the shadow of some terrible crime. This one recalled a father murdered. This one a brother waylaid and shot. This one a house pillaged and burned. This one a relative assassinated. This one a grievous insult while at peace at home. This one a robbery of all his earthly possessions. This one the force that compelled him to witness the brutal treatment of a mother or sister. This one was driven away from his own like a thief in the night. This one was threatened with death for opinion's sake. This one was proscribed at the instance of some designing neighbor. This one was arrested wantonly and forced to do the degrading work of a menial, while all had more or less of wrath laid up against the day when they were to meet face to face and hand to hand those whom they had good cause to regard as the living embodiment of unnumbered wrongs. So here we see what the circumstances are of the men that came to be part of Quantrill's command. Quantrill, because of his natural gift, talent to military leadership, understood these things completely and structured his force and equipped it with weapons that would make the most of the courage and the determination that their circumstances in war life had given them. So you see, there's a whole process going on here. These men are like unpolished diamonds, if you please. Quantrill was the master jeweler. He saw in them, he saw how to polish these men, how to turn them into more than just men wanting revenge for wrongs done, but into, quite frankly, the most terrible killing machines on horseback that the world's ever seen. And there, still much details ahead of how he did that.
That's an amazing talent that he developed over time, both with James Lane as well as anything else that he got. Are you aware of any kind of other military training he had?
Absolutely not. He didn't have any.
So just sheer intellectual horsepower and paying attention to details that allowed him to develop that. That's pretty impressive, really.
Yes, and he had that same motivation. His men, he had that intense motivation, and he wasn't a man who enjoyed killing. That I never see that in all of my study and research on him. He didn't enjoy it. It wasn't like the Redlegs that enjoyed what they did. They were predators.
Yeah.
And Dennis, about weasels and how they'll go into a chicken house and kill 100 chickens and not eat any of them.
Yep.
They just enjoy killing them. But that wasn't Quantrill, and that wasn't, with rare exceptions. Now, anytime you have a group of men, you're going to get a bad apple every now and then. And we'll talk about some of those too. We're going to look at a lot of Quantrill's men, because he didn't have that many. Usually about 50 or 60. At one point he had, Trosis, I think he had 350 was the most he ever had under his command at one time.
And yet the damage that they did throughout. And I reckon you're going to be talking about that in the next section. Would that be right?
Well, actually, what we got next? Let's see. Hang on a minute.
While you're doing that, we've got about 23 minutes to go for a 2-hour window. Will that work for you?
Yep.
All right.
Yep. In fact, we can get into that. Got just a little bit more on what I'm talking about here. Then we'll get into Quantrill's. Excuse me. We'll get into Quantrill's first battle in the war, and it will also explain to you, how his command came together and grew. Let's do that. Let's see here. All right, let me get back on my notes. Okay. Troll makes this point. He says, honorable soldiers in the Confederate Army, amenable or agreeable to every generous impulse and exact in the performance of every manly duty, deserted even the ranks which they had adorned and became desperate guerrillas because the home they had left had been given to the flames or a gray-haired father shot upon his own hearthstone. They wanted to avoid the uncertainty of regular battle and know by actual results how many died as a propitiation or a sacrifice. So he's actually pointing out that a lot of Confederate deserters only deserted because, they got word that somebody in their family had been murdered or their farm had been burned, or their family killed. He's saying, that they then had the same desire Quantrill had. They wanted to go and they wanted to track down those people and kill them.
Yeah.
So what he's trying to tell us is, that they didn't want to die just in a big set piece Civil War battle after that happened. They wanted to be personally involved back at the old home place, back in their own territory. That's why they deserted. He says every other passion became subsidiary to that of revenge, They sought personal encounters that their own handiwork might become mistakenly manifest. Those who died by other agencies than their own were not counted in the general summing up of the fight, nor were the solacements of any victory sweet to them unless they had the knowledge of being important factors in its achievement. As this class of guerrilla increased, the warfare of the border became necessarily more cruel and unsparing. Where at first there was only killing in ordinary battle, there came to be no quarter shown. The wounded of the enemy, let me know when you get that turned off. Oh.
Sorry about that.
I think he needs to improve his taste in music.
Boy, he does, doesn't he?
Yes, sir.
Sorry about that, guys.
All right. Okay, so where at first there was only killing ordinary battle, there came to be no quarter shown. The wounded of the enemy next felt the might of this individual vengeance, acting through a community of bitter memories, and from every stricken field there began by and by to come up the substance of this awful bulletin. Dead, such and such a number, wounded, none. The war had then passed into its fever heat, and therefore the gentle and the merciful, equally with the harsh and the revengeful, spared nothing clad in blue that could be captured. So what we're learning is how the Quantrill guerrillas came to fight under the black flag, which means no quarter given. And yet we're going to see, as Trow documents, time and time again, when they had captured Union soldiers, Quantrill showed them mercy. He gave them one chance. The young ones and the ones that pleaded for their lives and their families, he let some of them go, and he told them, if you go back into the army, we will kill you. There will be no second chance. And I think Trow even details one of the instances where they caught a guy the second time. And Quantrill went up and talked to him, and he said, I gave you a chance. I gave you a chance. I spared your life, and this is how you paid me back. You went back in the Union Army.
Wow.
And so he killed him. All right. We're going to get into... Hang on, I got to go. I'm glad I didn't close that website down now, because I've got to work off of the PDF copy. I'm out of notes.
Uh-oh.
Okay. All right, let's talk about Quantrill's first battle in the Civil War. Let me grab a drink of water here. So, Quantrill, together with Captain Blunt, returned from Richmond, Virginia, in the fall of 1861 with his commission from under the hand of Jeff Davis to operate at will along the Kansas border. He's now officially a Confederate officer. So people say, well, Quantrill, was never part of the Confederate Army. That's wrong. So he went to work organizing his guerrillas, his band, and his first exploits were confined to only 8 men, and these are named here in the book. Now, William Hallard, James and John Little, Edward Cogar, Andrew Walker, son of Morgan Walker, at whose farm Quantrill got rid of the last but 2 of the band that murdered his brother and left himself to die, and John Hampton, James Kelly, and Solomon Bashman. This little band knew nothing whatever of war, and they only knew how to fight and shoot. They lived on the border, and they had some old scores to settle with the Jayhawkers. These 8 men, or rather 9, for Quantrill commanded, encountered their first hereditary enemies, the Jayhawkers. Lane entered Missouri only on grand occasions. Jennison only once in a while on a frolic. One was a colossal thief, the other a picayune one. Lane dealt in mules by herds, horses by droves, wagons by parks, slaves by whole neighborhoods, household effects by the ton, and miscellaneous plunder by the cityful. And what do you think became of all the money they got from that?
I have no idea.
I'm sure Lane did not donate it to the federal government.
I bet you're right.
You know? And I'll bet that there ended up being an awful lot of cash that's created around Lawrence, Kansas. And especially out in the boonies around Lawrence, Kansas. Anyway, Jennison contented himself with the pocketbooks of his prisoners, the pin money of the women, and the wearing apparel of the children. Lane was a real prophet of demagogism, with insanity latent in his blood. Jennison, a quote-unquote sans culotte, and I do not know what that means. Sans means without, and I don't know what culotte means. Who, looking upon himself as a bastard, sought to become legitimate by becoming brutal. So it was in the neighborhood of Morgan Walker. Remember, Morgan Walker is the guys, where they used the shotguns to kill off those redlegs.
Right.
Okay, so in that vicinity, the Quantrill, he was in there in that vicinity with his little command, and he ambushed a portion of Jennison's regiment, killed 5 of his thieves, getting some good saddles, horses, bridles, and revolvers. See, there's a little skirmish right there. The next fight occurred upon the premises of Volney Ryan. Man, I'm telling you, somebody could track that down. There might be some records, and you could find out where Volney Ryan lived.
Absolutely.
See? We're getting into leads now. He was a citizen of Jackson County, so they were in Jackson County. With a company of Missouri militia, a company of militia notorious for 3 things: robbing hen roosts, stealing horses, and running away from the enemy. The 8 guerrillas struck them just at daylight, charged through them, charged back again, and when they returned from the pursuit, they counted 15 dead, the fruits of a running battle. There you go.
Yep.
You see, I'll bet you that site's never been touched with a detector.
I bet you're right.
And this is one example of what ultimately will be hundreds, Dennis, hundreds. Wow. An old man by the name of Searcy, claimed to be a Southern man, was stealing all over Jackson County and using violence here and there when he could not succeed through persuasion. Quantrill swooped down on him one afternoon, tried him that night, and hanged him the next morning. 4 guerrillas dragging on the rope. 75 head of horses were found in the dead man's possession, all belonging to the citizens of the county, and any number of deeds to small tracts of land, notes, and mortgages, and private accounts. All were returned. The execution acted as a thunderstorm. It restored the equilibrium of the moral atmosphere. The border warfare had found a chief. The 8 guerrillas had now grown to 50. Among the new recruits were David Poole, John Jarrett, William Coger, Richard Burns, George Todd, George Sheffers, I think it's supposed to be Shepard, and guess what? Coleman Younger. Otherwise known as Cole Younger. And he says, and myself and several others of like enterprise and daring. So he's telling you that Tro was right in on this at the start of the Quantrill guerrilla organization. An organization was at once infected. Quantrill was made captain, William Haller first lieutenant, William Gregg second, George Todd third, John Jarrett orderly sergeant. The Eagles were beginning to congregate. This is interesting. Tro describes each man's character, his personality. He says, Poole, an unschooled Aristophanes of the Civil War, laughed at calamity and mocked when any man's fear came. But for its picturesqueness, his speech would have been comedy personified. He laughed loudest when he was deadliest and treated fortune with no more dignity in one extreme than in another. Gregg, a grim Saul among the guerrillas, made of the Confederacy a mistress, and like the Douglas of old, was ever tender and true to her. Jarrett, the man who never knew fear, added to fearlessness an immense activity and indomitable will. He was a soldier in the saddle par excellence. John Coger never missed a battle or a bullet. Wounded 13 times, he lived as an exemplification of what a guerrilla could endure, the amount of lead he could comfortably get along with and keep fat. Steadfastness was his test of merit, comradeship his point of honor. He who had John Coger at his back had a mountain. Wow. Todd was the incarnate devil of battle. He thought of fighting when awake, dreamed of it at night, mingled talk of it in Hicksation, whatever Hicksation is, and went hungry many a day and shelterless many a night that he might find his enemy and have his fill of fight. Quantrill always had to hold him back, and yet he was his thunderbolt. He discussed nothing in the shape of orders. A soldier who discusses is like a hand which would think. He only charged. Where he attacked in front, a charge. Where he attacked in the rear, a charge. On either flank, a charge. Finally, in a desperate charge and doing a hero's work upon the stricken rear of the 2nd Colorado, he was killed. This was George Todd. Shepard, a patient, cool, vigilant leader, knew all the roads and streams, all the fords and passes, all modes of egress and ingress, all safe and dangerous places, all the treacherous non-combatants and all the trustworthy ones. In other words, citizens. Everything indeed that the few needed to know who were fighting the many. You see, Dennis, how much these guys sound like a special forces unit?
They do. And it amazes me. One of the things, this whole storyline tonight has really kind of paralleled in terms of what we see in the theater of war nowadays with guerrilla activity and special units fighting. And it actually, I see some parallels with our current situation here with all the activity going on with the BLM and that stuff, you know. There's a lot of folks getting riled up about that as well. But, you know, right now, Dorian, we're at an hour 52. Let's reach a kind of a closure. I've got a couple things I need to get involved with my son when I'm playing that outrageous music. But if you don't mind, are we going to do a story tonight, or is that special for Mike when he's on here?
I really
stopping point.
No, I've got about a paragraph to go.
Go one more paragraph or two or whatever.
Yeah, it won't take a couple minutes here.
Okay, sure.
And we'll finish up this chapter. It's a good stopping point.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay, so this guy knew all modes of egress and ingress, all safe and dangerous places, and so on. Everything, indeed, that the few need to know who were fighting the many. In addition, there were few among the guerrillas who were better pistol shots. It used to do Quantrill good to see him in the skirmish line. Coleman Younger, a boy, having still about his neck the purple marks of a rope made the night when the Jayhawkers shot down his old father and strung him up to a blackjack, that is a blackjack oak, spoke rarely, and he was away a great deal in the woods. What was he doing? His companions began to ask one of another. He had a mission to perform. He was pistol practicing. Soon he was perfect, and then he laughed often and talked a good deal. There had come to him now that intrepid gaiety that plays with death. He changed devotion to his family into devotion to his country, and he fought and killed with the conscience of a hero. And by the way, Dennis, we're going to see that very soon after he had perfected his pistol work, he shot an enemy at 71 yards with his pistol.
That's really a long way, yeah.
Yeah.
I cycle a lot of rounds through mine, and that's a long way to hit it.
Yep. Well, okay, so there we are on part one of our story about the uncivil war that became the Civil War.
But pretty amazing story, for sure. And I look forward to the rest of them. I've got screaming out here. Somebody wanting this story or something. We got anything?
Oh, oh, Bill wants his treasure story.
He's whining, I think. I might not.
Is he?
Yeah, sort of, maybe.
I hate to see a grown man whimper.
Yeah, how big an old boy is he? I don't want to be saying that. He's like Mike Squatch. I damn sure don't. Whoops.
All right, we're going to ding you for that one.
Yeah, I just got dinged.
Okay. Let's see here. Yeah, let's see. Trying to think which ones I've told and which ones I haven't. Let's see here. Okay.
I'm putting you on the spot. He said he got his cheese and he got his wine too, so there you go.
Have I told the story of the man that found a treasure while looking for a cannonball?
I don't think so.
Let's tell that one anyway, Bill. And if I've told it already, you're just going to have to get over it. I need to make up a list of stories, so I have it right here. I can just pull one out. You get to the end of a program and you're kind of starting to get tired, run down. You don't think as quick. All right. Yeah. There was one of the early metal detector companies was called Detex, and I know Dennis remembers them.
Oh yeah.
And the original founder of the company was a man named William Bill Mahan, and he was a real land pirate. He had some adventures. He found some treasures. And anyway, after he started detecting, before he started the detecting company, he got the hankerings to find a Civil War cannonball. And so he went to Arkansas, and somebody told him about a big battlefield called Jenkins Ferry, which, Dennis, did you ever hunt Jenkins Ferry?
I did. I have, yes.
Okay. Anyway, it's basically in a river bottom swamp, and it's huge, a lot of acres in there, hundreds of acres, the battlefield. But he knew it was a big battle, so he figured that, that he might go up there and find a cannonball. And the battle was fought because the Saline River, which ordinarily is, not very deep, maybe 4 to 6 feet deep, and banks about 8 or 10 feet high on each side in this area. But when the river comes up enough to fill that ditch, it's not that wide, but when the water gets over the top of the banks, it'll spread out a mile in each direction. So the whole river becomes 2 miles wide, and in the swamps, it's a foot to 18 inches deep. So this was the case when General Steele, the Federal Army, his 10,000-man army has not been getting the worst of it in their little dust-ups with the Rebs. And they're trying to flee back to their base at Little Rock. And they enter the Saline River bottoms there at Jenkins Ferry. And they discover that the bottoms are full of water. And they get to the ferry crossing about a mile away. And the river is no longer, 4 to 6 feet deep. It's about 15 feet deep now because it's flooded. But they have a pontoon bridge, a wagon train with them, so they bring that up. And word comes from one of the rear guard that the rebels that are pursuing them are entering the bottoms a mile away. So General Steele sends some of his men, some of his regiments back up to hold off the rebels while they build the pontoon bridge and get the army across the flooded river. Otherwise, they're trapped and they're going to end up getting destroyed or having to surrender. So the Battle of Jenkins Ferry was, fought in knee-deep water. And I'll tell you what, the bullets went deep there, Dennis. I got one with a Garrett Deep Seeker 14-inch coil, 23.5 measured inches.
Wow.
That was my deepest. Getting them at 18 to 20 inches was pretty common there with a big 14-inch coil. Anyway, so Bill Mahan, without researching the battle, he goes to the Jenkins Ferry crossing where they built the pontoon bridge, and he starts hunting on the other side of the river, on the battle side of the river. But he's a mile from the battlefield, and he doesn't know it. So he gets a signal. It sounds like something big, and he digs down about 18 inches, and he hears his shovel hit clunk like cast iron, and he digs out enough to where he can see that it is rusty cast iron, and it's rounded. So he's all excited. He thinks he's found a cannonball. Well, the problem is, because of the water, and that soil on the bottoms is alluvial, it's sandy loam, it's really soft, even in the road. And they only fired 2 shots. The Rebs didn't even bring their cannons into the bottoms. And the Yankees had 1 cannon in the road, and they fired it twice, and it sank all the way up to the axles. And that's the only shots that were fired. And they were a mile away in the wrong direction, from where Bill Mahan was hunting for a cannonball. So, as he tried to expose more of it, he saw 3 little metal tits sticking up in a triangle, and he realized what he'd found was an old cast iron pot upside down. And in disgust, he got up and started filling the hole back in. Was gonna leave, and then he thought he remembered his wife liked those old cast iron things. He thought, well, I'll go ahead and dig the pot out. I put this much work into it. It took him another hour to dig around the pot to where he could get his fingers under the edge and lift it up out of the hole. And when he did, underneath it was $60,000 in gold coins, U.S. gold coins.
Wow.
$60,000. All dates were in the 1800s. And from that find, what came the money to start the Detex Metal Detecting Company, which existed for quite a few years.
Yeah, I did not know that's how they started.
Yeah,
boy, I remember them.
Few people do. I got that story from Bill Mahan Jr.
Wow. That's a treasure. So, Bill, I'll tell you what, next week, Dorian, after we do it, I will give you all a story of an unfound treasure that it's still there, and I'll share with y'all that, and that'd be something that might be of interest if you can do the legwork. Got to come to Texas, though.
Oh, wait a minute now, Dennis. Bill's going to want you to give him an X marks the spot, or he's going to end up partaking of more wine than cheese.
I know. I gave him the state of Texas. I mean,
well, that narrows it down.
Yeah, that narrows it down.
Good
Brother, listen. Hey, I've enjoyed sharing with you. We'll do this again here next few weeks. I'll be better next week. You can give me some of this material so I can at least sound like I know something. And for the rest of these guys, thank y'all for hanging around. What were you going to say, Dorian?
I think you did real good, Dennis. It's just, good grief, man. We anytime, I know from just working with Mike, it took us two or three shows to kind of get our rhythm, and so this is great. I think you are going to fit in real well in this scenario here. So
there you go. All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate y'all's time. Dorian, appreciate your time. Mike, hope we did a fair job there on my part. We appreciate all you guys, and we'll see y'all next week. So y'all take care, and we'll see you down the road.
And remember, the treasure you find might be mine.
Absolutely. Night all.
Good night.
All right.